History is often told through the stories of empires and armies, but sometimes the most profound changes are driven by figures who operate just outside the spotlight. Today, we're exploring a chapter of economic history you probably never learned in school. The story of a merchant dynasty that reshaped Asian commerce, and how their journey reveals the complex machinery of colonial economics. Our story begins in 1832, in Baghdad. A prominent merchant family, the Sassoons, decided to leave. Led by the patriarch Dabi Sassoon, they were searching for new opportunities beyond the confines of their homeland. After a brief period in Iran, they set their sights on a bustling port city that was rapidly becoming the commercial heart of British India, Bombay, now known as Mumbai. Why Bombay? It was a city buzzing with potential. As a major colonial port, its trade networks were expanding at an incredible rate. Cotton exports were booming, and a unique and powerful organization was cementing its control over the region: the British East India Company. Now, to truly grasp what the Sassoons were walking into, we need to understand the East India Company. This wasn't just a business. Imagine a corporation that had its own army, ran its own court systems, and governed vast territories with millions of people. By the 1830s, the company controlled a land mass larger than Western Europe. It answered not to a government, but primarily to its shareholders, and a huge part of its revenue came from agricultural commodities. One of those commodities would soon change the world. David Sassoon arrived in Bombay with limited funds, but he possessed three invaluable assets. First, he had extensive commercial networks, stretching across the Middle East, built on family ties and trust. Second, his family's history in government gave him a deep understanding of how power and trade economics worked. And third, his timing was perfect. He arrived just as the colonial economy was restructuring, creating massive opportunities for merchants who knew how to navigate the system. The biggest opportunity of all was tied to a major problem plaguing the British Empire: the China trade. Britain had a ravenous appetite for Chinese goods like tea, silk, and porcelain. The problem: China had almost no interest in anything Britain was selling. This created a massive trade imbalance, forcing Britain to pay for everything in silver. We're talking about a staggering amount, an estimated £8 million a year flowing out of Britain, which in today's money is hundreds of millions of dollars. This silver drain was a serious threat to Britain's economic stability. British authorities tried everything. They sent diplomats to negotiate better trade terms, but were repeatedly rejected by the Chinese court. They tried marketing British manufactured goods, but found few takers. The fundamental imbalance remained. So, colonial administrators in India devised a controversial but highly effective solution. The plan was to use India's agricultural lands to cultivate poppies on an industrial scale. The raw material would be processed in Indian facilities into opium, which would then be exported to China. The proceeds from these sales would, in turn, be used to buy Chinese tea and other goods. From a purely economic viewpoint, the logic was brutal but simple. It created a product the Chinese market would consume, reversing the flow of silver and generating immense revenue for British India. In fact, by the 1830s, this trade accounted for roughly 14% of the entire revenue of the colonial government, funding its administration and infrastructure. It's crucial to see this through the lens of the 19th century. Opium was legal in Britain and widely used in medicines. The modern understanding of addiction was still in its infancy. What made this situation so different and so devastating was the scale. This wasn't about small-scale medicinal use. It was industrial-level production and mass distribution, which led to widespread social disruption in China's coastal regions. From the Chinese perspective, this was a catastrophe. They saw their silver flowing out, their communities disrupted, and a social crisis unfolding. While they had used opium medicinally for centuries, they had no historical precedent for an influx on this scale. This is the world David Sassoon entered. He analyzed the system and saw a clear opportunity. The trade was operating under the protection of British law and its military. It required complex logistics and skilled merchants to manage the supply chain. He saw not just a market opportunity, but the potential to build generational wealth. So why should we care about this story today? First, it's a powerful lesson in economic history, showing how global trade and immense fortunes were built within colonial systems. Second, It forces us to confront complex ethical questions. The trade was legal, but its consequences were devastating. It shows how economic incentives can create powerful, and often destructive, social currents. Finally, it's about recognizing patterns. The interplay between business, government, and ethics, and the global consequences of supply and demand are themes that are just as relevant today as they were 2 centuries ago. Understanding this overlooked chapter of history helps us better understand the world we live in now. Have you ever wondered how some of the world's biggest fortunes were made? Sometimes, the story isn't as clean as you might think. Let's talk about the Sassoons, a family that built a global empire, but started with a business model that went far beyond simple buying and selling. In the 19th century, most merchants were just middlemen. They'd buy goods at auctions, ship them, and sell them for a profit. But David Sassoon had a much bigger vision. He realized that to build real, lasting power, you had to control the entire process from start to finish. This is called vertical integration. Within just a few years, the Sassoons weren't just trading. They were financing Indian farmers to grow their products, guaranteeing a steady supply. They built their own warehouses in key ports to cut down on costs and delays. They even launched their own fleet of ships, so they didn't have to rely on anyone else for transport. To top it all off, they created their own insurance companies to manage risk and keep every last penny of profit within the family. It was a brilliant, modern business strategy, and it worked. The scale of their operation was staggering. By 1836, they were shipping 30,000 chests of product a year. By the late 1850s, that number had exploded to nearly 60,000 chests, totaling over £7 million annually. They weren't just participating in the market, they were dominating it, using sophisticated methods like standardized operations, financial planning, and professional accounting that were way ahead of their time. But what was this product that was making them so rich? It was opium. And their biggest market was China. The Sassoons built a strategic partnership with the British colonial authorities. They financed colonial projects and became reliable partners, offering capital whenever the government needed it. In return, they received legitimacy and protection. It was a win-win. The British got trade expansion and revenue without getting their hands dirty, and the Sassoons got official approval and access to incredibly profitable markets. This flood of opium into China had devastating effects. Economically, it caused a massive outflow of silver, reversing centuries of a trade surplus and causing chaos in coastal regions. Socially, widespread addictions strained families, destroyed communities, and tanked workplace productivity. The Chinese government was losing control, and it knew it had a crisis on its hands. Initially, local officials tried to fight back, but they were powerless against foreign merchants protected by the British. The situation became so dire that the emperor appointed a special official, Lin Zexu, a man known for his integrity and determination to solve the problem once and for all. In 1839, Lin Zexu took decisive action. He surrounded the foreign merchant warehouses in Canton and demanded they surrender all their opium. He refused to back down. In a dramatic move, he confiscated over 1,400 tons of opium from British and American merchants. Then, in a powerful symbolic act, he had it all publicly destroyed, mixed with lime and salt, and dumped into the ocean. Lin Zexu even wrote a letter to Queen Victoria, pleading his case. He pointed out that opium was a strictly controlled substance in Britain. He asked a simple, powerful question. Why was a substance considered so dangerous in Britain being forced upon the people of China? How could that be morally justified? From a legal standpoint, China was well within its rights to confiscate contraband within its own borders, but Britain's response wasn't about morality or law. It was about money. The destruction of the opium represented a huge financial loss and threatened the entire trade system that had solved Britain's trade imbalance with China. So, Britain chose war. The First Opium War was a one-sided conflict. Britain's modern navy crushed China's coastal defenses. The resulting Treaty of Nanking in 1842 was humiliating for China. They were forced to pay millions in silver, open 5 ports to British trade, and give up Hong Kong. Crucially, it granted British citizens extraterritoriality meaning they couldn't be prosecuted under Chinese law. The Sassoons, who had supported Britain during the war with ships and money, reaped the rewards. They got first access to the new ports, and their business exploded. The opium trade, while not technically legalized, became unstoppable. But China's resistance didn't end. In the 1850s, Chinese officials again tried to crack down on the trade. Britain, now joined by France, responded with even greater force in the Second Opium War. This time, they marched all the way to Beijing and infamously looted and burned the old Summer Palace, a priceless cultural treasure. The war ended with the Treaty of Tientsin in 1860, which finally explicitly legalized the opium trade. With their business now fully legal and protected, the Sassoons began to diversify. They invested their immense profits into legitimate industries. Cotton, tea, silk, banking, real estate, railroads, and telegraphs. Every rupee earned from opium was reinvested, creating jobs, building infrastructure, and making the family essential to the regional economy. When anyone questioned the origins of their wealth, they could simply point to all the good they were doing. The story of the Sassoons is a powerful case study in how controversial wealth can be laundered into legitimate enterprise over time. It raises big questions. When do economic interests override ethics, and how much does time really change our perception of how fortunes are made? Thanks for watching. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into history.